Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for letting me speak English. It's, of course, a great privilege to be able to do so, and thank you for arranging everything and for having me here. Everything has been impeccable, and it's a real pleasure to be here. And you can see what I'm going to speak about. I hope you agree that it is probably one of the most famous issues in the history of science. Why did Newton believe in action at a distance? And before I start, I should say, I know I'm speaking to a mixed audience here, philosophers, different fields. I'm a historian. I've always been trained as a historian, not as a scientist, not as a philosopher. So I seek to explain these scientists historically. I'm not here to offer value judgments. I hope that doesn't put you off. And I hope even more than that once I'm finished, you'll be excited about the things history can tell us about problems in the history of science. And I hope that's the case because what I'm going to tell you, I think, might be a little unexpected, because what I'm going to do is to suggest that Newton's belief in action at a distance came, at least in part, from his own historical beliefs, his own beliefs about history. And I want to suggest that once we look at Newton's historical beliefs, we get a really very clear vision of why he believed in action at a distance. And so that's what I'm going to do. Now, before I do that, we have to start by asking, why is this a problem at all? Well, let me explain quickly. Now, you'll all know Newton's most famous finding in the Principia that he published in 1687. This is a proof that the elliptical form of planetary orbits results from a centripetal force inversely proportional to the square of the distance between celestial objects. Here you have it in modern notation. And despite the development of quantum physics, this is obviously still a central finding to modern science, hugely useful, not least for holding up projectors, among other things. Now, Newton called this force, or this process, gravity. But, and this is absolutely crucial, he never posited a causal explanation for gravity. And you might agree, wisely so, given that we're still looking for one. How Newton saw his own achievement was that on the basis of extensive observations and empirical data, and then calculations based on that data, he described mathematically the physical relations between bodies, but not the physical cause between those relations. And as you can see, this is exactly what he says in the Principia. Right? I'm not talking about causes, he says. And this is what he meant when he called his work the Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, the mathematical principles of natural philosophy. Natural philosophy is what science was called at the time. But this led to big problems, because although such a conclusion might be acceptable by the standards of modern science, by the standards of what was called natural philosophy in the 17th century, this was very dubious, because traditionally, for an explanation to be considered scientific, it had not only to describe the phenomena, but to offer a causal explanation, to give a cause. And so, to some of Newton's earliest readers, most famously Leibniz, they accused him of not doing proper natural philosophy at all. They said that if you're not offering a physical cause to explain gravity, then you're not offering any scientific explanation at all. And so the question becomes, how did Newton deal with this problem? And how should we interpret him dealing with it? And there's been quite what we might call, or summarize as a standard explanation in the literature. And the standard explanation is very simple. It's simply to deny that Newton believed in action at a distance. So, for example, the great mid-20th century historian and philosopher of science, Alexander Koyré, who you've probably heard of, wrote, I quote, that it would be a mistake to assume that Newton postulates action at a distance. And he was followed in this opinion by lots of others. Now, I don't think this is right, but let's assume for a minute that this is correct. This would then raise the question, how does Newton think gravity happens if it's not action at a distance? And this is what the last 30 years of Newton scholarship has really obsessed over. And of course, there's been lots of different answers, but really they come together and they suggest two different things. First, they suggest that Newton had a metaphysics in which we're going to find the answer to precisely this problem. And second, they suggest that this metaphysics was in some sense vaguely animist. That's to say that for Newton, an omnipresent God explains physical causation by acting as the medium through which matter interacts. And if I may, I'll quote at this point a scholar who's probably done more than anyone to develop this view. It's Andrew Janiak, a nice, good Polish name. From Newton's point of view, God, in fact, never acts at a distance on any object at any time in the history of the world. And this is what Janiak and others call Newton's metaphysics, a non-empirical vision of God's action in the world that shapes the rest of his natural philosophy. So here's a standard reading. Newton didn't believe in action at a distance, and he explained gravity by positing a metaphysics of an omnipresent God who acts locally on all objects. So, what I want to do for you today is to argue something quite different. Of course, I agree with all the literature that Newton believed in God, and he believed that God was omnipresent. This is obvious. But I don't think that Newton had an elaborate metaphysics. Rather, I think that Newton was deliberately and consciously agnostic about precisely how God interacted with the world. Newton actively refused to say how God interacted with the world and what form God's omnipresence took. And the reason Newton did this is because he thought that such speculation was hubristic and overreaching, and that history had shown that it led to both philosophical and religious error. And specifically, Newton thought that that error was characteristic of the discipline of metaphysics, which he unequivocally rejected as an intellectual enterprise. And this is what I'm going to try and show you now. And the text I want to begin with is the General Scholium, which is a short essay added to the second edition of the Principia in 1713. Now, this text is hugely important because it's here that Newton seems to set out both his scientific methodology and also his views about God. And it's this text on which most of the modern interpreters base their readings. But unfortunately, this text is also incredibly ambiguous. And so much of what I want to do today is to try and unravel some of the ambiguities in this text. And here's the portion of the text I'm concerned with. It's quite long, but I think we really do need this, and I'm going to explain what it's about. So I'll just summarize it for you. So at the start, he's talking about God. But notice that straight away he says that God is not the world soul. This is very important, and we'll come back to this. And then we have some negative passages about God not being duration and space. He's not eternity and infinity, and so on. And then we have Newton famously saying that God is omnipresent and that in him all things are contained and move. And then we have a long historical note claiming that this opinion was held by the ancients, some of whom he lists. But then he says, I put it in red for you, that idolaters also thought that parts of the world were parts of the supreme God, but they were mistaken. And I want to start with these historical passages. And I'd like you to notice that we already have a very ambiguous, complicated historical vision. Because on the one hand, Newton is saying that some of the ancients were correct to recognize God's omnipresence, but on the other hand, many of them seem to go wrong in confusing this omnipresence for some kind of animism, which they turned into idolatry, as you see. Now, if we only had this, we wouldn't get anywhere. It's just too ambiguous. Newton could mean anything here. But thankfully, we have a lot more than just this. We have a huge number of manuscripts which Newton wrote but kept private, and the vast majority of which are actually now in Jerusalem. How they got there is a fascinating story. If you want to hear it, I can tell you later. But what's particularly important for us is that a huge number of these manuscripts are concerned with exactly this historical story, but in much, much more detail. And when I say detail, I really do mean it. We're talking about thousands and thousands of pages, most of which look something like this. So you can see most of it is in Latin, lots of Greek, also some Hebrew. And it seems to me that without understanding these manuscripts, we just can't understand what Newton is saying in the general scholium. Well, thankfully, I've gone through them all, so you don't have to. And the results are something like this. Now, this won't make any sense to you at the moment, but what I'll do now is explain it, and hopefully it will make sense at the end. So speaking very roughly, Newton believed in 4 stages in the historical development of opinions about God and about the animation of the world. Like everyone at the time, Newton works with a standard biblical chronology. There's no funny deviations here. And Newton could have this belief because from around the mid-1680s, he undertook a huge program of reading in the history of religion and philosophy. And in fact, we can reconstruct this reading because most of Newton's own books survive in the library of Trinity College in Cambridge. And so here, for example, you have Newton's copy of Gerhard Vossius's Theologia Gentilis. And as you can see, Newton would fold the corners of pages to passages he was interested in. So we can really follow his reading very closely as he developed his ideas. So what were those ideas? Say there's something like this. Newton believed that God had revealed to Adam a kind of ur-religion that went hand in hand with certain scientific truths, including heliocentrism and the inverse square law. And this true religion was inherited by Noah after the flood. Here's one quotation. This philosophical religion recognized God's omnipresence. Here you can see this in this rather nice quotation, right? They reckoned the heavens to be a temple of God, and it represented the whole system of the heavens. So that's the first correct philosophical religion, which is group 1 on our table. But what's really important is group 2. Because according to Newton, the first corruption of the philosophical religion stemmed specifically from trying to explain how God was omnipresent. And according to Newton, this led to what in modern terminology we would call animism. Through misunderstanding and trying to explain God's omnipresence, various pagans, beginning with the Egyptians, began to animate the world and attribute divinity to its various parts. So this led to a kind of anthropomorphic animist idolatry. And it wasn't just the ancients like the Egyptians who held this new view, because Newton also thought that the Greek philosophers held it. So this kind of animism for him characterized almost all Greek philosophies, with the Pythagoreans, the Platonists, the Stoics with their world souls, but even Aristotle with his intelligent celestial spheres. And this is why Newton is consistently so scathing about anima mundi theories, about world soul theories, not only in the passage of the general scholium which I showed you, but also in lots of the manuscripts. I won't quote them all because it's clear what he's saying. They all say the same thing. And so you see, this group 2, had achieved a mix of truth and error. On the one hand, they'd inherited the truth that God was omnipresent, but on the other hand, they'd corrupted that truth by positing philosophical explanations for how an omnipresent God could interact with the world. And this is what explains that ambiguous passage in the general scholium that I quoted for you earlier, the note. Now, the third and fourth groups aren't so important for us. I can summarize them quickly. The atomists, they're a bit like the second group, but rather than attribute motion to a deified anima mundi, they just attributed it to matter itself. So they're animists, but materialist ones. And the final group are the Cartesians, so the followers of Descartes, including Leibniz. And as you may know, Descartes himself had argued that God is entirely unextended, that he doesn't exist within space. So for Newton, the Cartesians exist outside of this whole framework. But their error is the exact opposite one of groups 2 and 3, where those groups are animists, the Cartesians have gone in the other direction and removed God from the world altogether. And this is clear from lots and lots of passages. Again, I'll just give you one. You could see that Newton talking about his own philosophy having an omnipresent God, but not as the soul of the world, again. But Cartesian philosophy, which is represented by Leibniz, makes God an intelligentia supramundana. That's to say, it places God outside of the world. So, here we have Newton's vision of the history of religion and the history of philosophy. And I could give lots more evidence from the manuscripts. But I hope you see where I'm going here now. So let's return to our central questions. Did Newton believe in action at a distance? Or did he, as others think, hold an elaborate metaphysics in which God is omnipresent and thus action doesn't actually happen at a distance? And it seems to me that once we've established Newton's historical views in this way, the answer is quite clear. Because if you accept this reading, then Newton is celebrating the agnosticism of group 1. And he's also portraying himself as agnostic exactly about how God interacts with the world. God is omnipotent, and he can do it in any way he wants. Yes, he's omnipresent, but we simply don't know how he operates in the world. And to explain this by building some kind of metaphysics is going to be dangerous, because it's going to lead you into the error of group 2, or maybe group 3. So I hope that maybe you agree that we've already gone quite far in proving that Newton didn't deny action at a distance. But for the sake of argument, let's assume you're skeptical. You might say, well, this doesn't prove anything. Maybe Newton thought that group 1 did have a metaphysics of God's omnipresence. Well, I think I can answer such an objection as well. And I can do it by showing you that he considered metaphysics as the archetypal intellectual exercise of group 2. Whereas his own philosophy was not metaphysical and not idolatrous, he thought. And to understand this, we have to go even deeper into Newton's theology. or more precisely, his views on the history of theology. Because as some of you might know, Newton was a heretic. Newton was an anti-Trinitarian. He denied the divinity of Christ. We don't need to go into the exact details of this here, but what we do have to say is that Newton had a very, very precise sense of how he believed non-Trinitarian Christianity had been corrupted by Trinitarianism. And again, he did a huge amount of historical work on this subject, and again, the evidence is all in the manuscripts because he kept his heresy secret. And so, to summarize very, very roughly, Newton believed that primitive, non-Trinitarian Christianity had been corrupted by pagan philosophy. And specifically and crucially, the key step in this corruption was the intrusion of something that Newton consistently called metaphysics. Here you have a lovely quotation from the manuscripts in Jerusalem. The grand occasion of errors in the faith has been the turning of the Bible from a moral and monarchical to a metaphysical sense. And then there's plenty more quotations to the same effect. But what exactly did Newton mean by this? What did he mean by metaphysics here? Well, it turns out that for Newton, the precise meaning of metaphysics was the hubristic search for explanations for how God actually operated in the world. Because Newton believed that the metaphysics that had corrupted early Christianity stemmed directly from the idolatry and philosophy that we'd earlier labeled as Group 2, the sort of Egyptian philosophy that posited an anima mundi. Again and again in his manuscripts, Newton tells us the story about how metaphysics has its origin in the theogony of the pagans. It was adopted by both the Greek philosophers, by the Jewish Kabbalists, and then it was that mixture that disastrously led the church into Trinitarianism. Could have picked many, many more quotations, but I think this is a very nice one, which shows that Newton believes that metaphysics has its origins, the theogony of the pagans, what we called Group 2, and that then leads into Trinitarianism. And then we see this quotation, this links this story directly to the general scholium. Again, from the Jerusalem manuscripts, it sounds exactly like the general scholium's emphasis on speaking about God relatively. And so this is what Newton meant time and time again when he said that his own science had nothing to do with metaphysics. Here you have a direct quotation to this effect. I really can't see how Newton could be any clearer that he's not doing anything that he thought could be considered metaphysics. But I hope that I've now explained to you what Newton meant by that very precisely. What he meant was that he was refusing to offer explanations for how God operated in the world. God might be omnipresent, but he's also omnipotent. And to fail to realize that is to fall back into pagan idolatry or metaphysics. They're the same thing. So we can now update our table. And it looks a bit like this. You see now that the error of the animists stemmed from adopting a metaphysical approach. He also thought that the Cartesians did that for another reason, but we don't need to go into that. And so looking at this table, I hope that I've convinced at least some of you that to understand Newton's own project in the general scholium, we have to understand it as a consciously anti-metaphysical project, and a project in which Newton deliberately limited the extent to which he thought one could say something about God's relationship with the world. And just, I'm giving you an agnostic Newton. He does not know how God operates. And just to kind of hammer home this agnosticism, here's a nice manuscript. This is what it usually looks like if you transcribe it. Obviously, this is absolutely useless, so I'll tidy it up for you. Here, everything comes together. The rejection of metaphysics metaphysical arguments are very slippery, means that we just cannot know how several things in nature occur, including the interaction between soul and body and gravity. From phenomena, the world may appear alive, nature may appear alive, Animism, group 2, but to speculate further and to explain this would be to return to the dreaded metaphysical arguments. As Newton says, we must stop where phenomena are wanting. So let me summarize as clearly as possible what I think this means. It means that Newton did believe in action at a distance. He simply refused to say how it occurred, as he says quite explicitly here when he mentions gravity. Okay. So I hope up to now that's been relatively clear and maybe even convincing. Although I know it's also been relatively technical. But now let me expand and talk a bit more generally about what this might mean for our understanding of Newton's project in the Principia. And I've talked quite a lot about Newton's ideas about God and what role God plays in explaining gravity and action at a distance. And as you have noticed, although God is clearly important for Newton, I've quite severely limited the role that God plays for Newton. Yes, of course, Newton's God providentially established the universe in such a way that gravity functioned exactly as it did. And this is absolutely clear from this quotation in the General Scholium. As you can see, Newton says that this most beautiful system of a solar system could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. So in this respect, God is obviously an important part of Newton's system. But this isn't very interesting. It doesn't tell us very much about how Newton thought gravity actually functioned. But as I've just argued, Newton was very cautious about how God functioned and what role he played in gravity. And this now raises, I think, quite an obvious and interesting question, and that question is, what came first? Was it the religion or the science? That's to say, did Newton not posit a metaphysical explanation for gravity because of his theological beliefs? Or was the theology simply developed later in compatibility with a previously held scientific view? Well, I think it helps if we think about it like this. Newton deliberately never posited an explanation for what caused gravity. Now, again, as I said earlier, this was deeply controversial because on the traditional definition of natural philosophy, the whole point is to provide causal explanations. This was, of course, a view in the Aristotelian tradition. It's a view of Descartes. It's a view of Descartes' followers like Leibniz. And so, as I said earlier, many people, including Leibniz, thought that Newton wasn't doing natural philosophy or science at all because he hadn't offered a causal explanation. And Newton didn't hide this. As I've shown you this quotation already. He's talking about the concept of force. This is a comment on definition 8, and as you can see here, he clearly says that he's not offering a discussion of the physical cause of gravity, but only a mathematical description, or even more clearly, here's a nice manuscript passage that he prepared around 1710 for the debate with Leibniz. As you can see very clearly, Newton says that he had been silent about the cause of gravity. So this seems quite clear. Newton hadn't given a cause for gravity. Now, given what I've said, you might think that this is all because of his theological views about God, about religion. But this is where we need to start looking at the chronology a bit more carefully, where we really need to be historians. because Newton only became interested in theology seriously in the late 1670s. He certainly wasn't a heretic and hadn't established the ideas about the history of religion that I told you about until the mid-1680s. But if we look at Newton's earlier scientific writings, we already see his belief that the application of mathematical methods to natural philosophy could provide generalized conclusions that were nonetheless not causal. And here I'd like to show you in particular a letter to Henry Oldenburg from June 1672. Now, it's a bit long, but you don't need to worry about it. I'll summarize it. Newton is here defending his theory of colors. As I'm sure you all know, Newton had proposed that through a single experiment he'd been able to show mathematically beyond doubt a property of light, that white light is composite and that its components exhibit different refraction coefficients, right? The famous prism experiments. And as you maybe also know, this elicited a lot of disagreement, especially from Robert Hooke, who was impressed by Newton's results, but suggested that Newton's explanation was only a hypothesis and could be explained in other ways. Now, in response, Newton resorted to this very strange and unusual language of properties, which I've highlighted for you. This is a very unusual term. It's not a standard philosophical term of the period. But you can see what it allows Newton to do. It allows him to argue that he's discovered, on the basis of experiment and deduction, certain properties of light, such as the unequal refrangibility of rays of different colors. What he hasn't done is offered a hypothesis by which those properties might be explained. That's to say, he has not offered a cause. So you have Newton already in 1672 saying that he'd established not causes, but properties. And this is the language he continued to use all the way through his career. So here you have a manuscript from the early 1700s, After Gravity. And as you can see again, what Newton says is that he's establishing the general properties of things. And you'll also see that he's claiming that this is the result of applying mathematics to science. To paraphrase, Newton says that applying maths to natural philosophy, one can make generalizations without making causal claims. And just as this was the case in 1703, it was the case back in 1670. So what I'm arguing is that as early as the 1670s, Newton had a clear methodological vision that remained consistent throughout his career. By applying maths to science, one could generate generalized results about the properties of things without implying a causal explanation. And just as a final support for this reading, I'd like to point out that Newton wasn't the only person who was using this kind of language and these kind of ideas, because it was also used by one other person who we know Newton certainly read when he was young, and we don't know about very many people who Newton read when he was young, and that's Galileo, in his dialogues concerning two new sciences, on the two great world systems. And this passage occurs after Galileo has developed his ideas on the principle of inertia, in which force is conceived not as an inherent property of a moving object, but as an impact or an activity from outside, but what the ultimate nature, essence, or cause of such a force, including gravity, is, Galileo said, we just don't know. So you see what Galileo says here is really quite similar to what Newton would say over half a century later. He says that as part of his mathematical exploration of force, he's not discovered causes at all. And as I say, we know that Newton read Galileo very early, in the early 1660s. So maybe he was at least partially inspired by this kind of methodological rhetoric. So now that we've established this chronology, we can return to the question I said earlier about what came first, the science or the religion. And it looks like Newton's causal agnosticism was not directly the product of his theological beliefs. It was developed earlier, in the 1660s and 1670s, before he'd really started to think about theology seriously. Now, of course, I repeat again, that's not to say that Newton's religious statements were insincere or unimportant for us as modern interpreters. As I hope you've seen, once we understand them properly, they really help us to understand Newton's science. But it seems that in the 1680s and 90s, Newton developed his religious views in a way that seemed to him compatible with his natural philosophical methodology, which he developed earlier. Okay, so I'm coming to the end of my time. So let me just draw some very large conclusions about what I've said, about what we do as historians of science. And the first thing I want to say is to reflect a bit more on the kind of work I did when I constructed this table for you. It's still quite common for historians to assume that this kind of historical thinking wasn't a part of the scientific revolution. That this is how people thought in the Renaissance, but then Descartes turned up and everyone stopped caring about history overnight. Because of course that's what Descartes said about himself. But I hope that what I've said today has shown you that this really isn't correct. Newton was obsessed with the historical precedents for his own position, and by reconstructing what he thought was the precedents for his own position and where people had gone wrong. And by understanding that, we've been able to understand his own position much, much better. Now, I should say, that's not because Newton obsessively venerated the past, or because he thought that the ancients were far cleverer than the moderns and that they knew everything. His view was much more modern than that. After all, every single modern scientist, me, you, anyone, does things on the basis of what they think their predecessors have or haven't achieved. It's just that in the 17th century, all scientists had excellent Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. So their view of what and who their predecessors were and what they had or hadn't achieved was very much shaped by that knowledge. And the second big conclusion I want to finish on for you is about the relationship between science and religion in this period. Because here again there's a tendency for some extreme views. Some people want to argue that early modern science had nothing to do with religion, and in fact it was directly opposed to it. And this is a view, for example, you get in the big recent book on the scientific revolution by David Wootton, who wants to say that Galileo, Newton, they were all secret atheists. I mean, this is just total nonsense. But then against this, quite a few modern historians want to argue that early modern science was basically all about God and religion. That people like Newton clearly cared so much about God and theology that their science must have been a subset of their religiosity. Are we okay? And I think that both of these extreme views aren't really quite right. Because if you've seen, it's obvious that Newton cared deeply about religion and its history and had a very precise conception of what a scientist could and couldn't say about God. But as I hope I've also showed you, Newton's views about God simply can't explain the development of his scientific methodology and his results. Newton believed in action at a distance, not because he held an elaborate metaphysics of God's omnipresence, but because from his earlier work on optics, his mathematical approach to natural philosophy allowed him to remain agnostic about causes, including the cause of gravity. Or to put it even more simply, just because Newton was very religious and had precise theological beliefs, it doesn't mean that we can reduce his science to his religiosity. So that's the final conclusion that I'd like to leave you with. You may want to talk about that or anything else that I've said. In the meantime, thank you very much for listening. Thank you.